So the definition of undigested stories is the process of being with a story experience that remains unprocessed and unresolved. It's sometimes unvoiced and sometimes invisible. The experience is embodied and often felt rather than expressed. This felt sense can be often experienced as a continuous fluctuation between awareness and unawareness.
Hello and welcome. I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Tracey Johnston as we take a communication perspective on undigested stories. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So, whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Tracey Johnston. Tracey lives and works in Aberdeen, Scotland at Possibilities Counselling and Psychotherapy. She was first trained in social work and then systemic psychotherapy. And in 2017, she was a fellow at the CMM Institute and completed a project along with Peter Robinson that contributed to a new addition to the loop model, which is an additional U that represents undigested stories. For those unfamiliar, the loop model is a tool within the coordinated management of meaning theory, and it explores the many kinds of stories that shape us. I'll include links in the show notes if you want to learn more. I have an early episode about this, as well as a short video and an infographic, but only the infographic is up to date enough to include Tracey and Peter's undigested stories, but the other resources still give good background if you're looking for that. This is our second episode of the Healing series, and it's so special to be able to include this conversation as part of this month. Tracey's work and project as a CMM Institute Fellow centered around grief. And she shares some really beautiful things in this conversation about what she's learned from those she works with and from her own experiences. Before we jump into the podcast, I would like to ask for your help. I'm beginning to think about the next season of the podcast, and in the true spirit of being CMM-ish, I want this to be something we co-create together so that we make sure this is continuing to be meaningful and adding value for all of us. So I have a survey. You're welcome to fill out part or all of it, and the link to that is in the show notes, but I'd love for you to contribute. Help me to understand how you're using the podcast, what you have been getting out of it, and what you hope to get out of it. So thank you for participating in that. Again, link to that is in the show notes. And for now, let's continue the conversation with Tracey. Hi, Tracey. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me along. I'm really excited to talk about, well, I guess what we're going to be talking about tonight, and the undigested part of the model now, the loop model.
Yes, I'm very excited to get to speak with you about that. And I would love to ask you to introduce yourself so we can have some context for who you are as we go into a conversation about some of what you do and what your work's about.
Sure. I'm a systemic psychotherapist at Possibilities Counselling and Psychotherapy in Aberdeen, Scotland. And I work there with my colleague, Peter Robinson, and I will probably refer quite a lot to Peter because he's been involved in a lot of the projects that I've been involved in. And Peter and I were involved in the CMM Fellows program back in 2017. I'm a mother. I have 3 children. I'm a wife and a companion to 2 golden retrievers. One of them is a mother, and the other one and the other one is her pup. So the pup is only 10 weeks old at the moment. So my life is full with that.
Yes.
And I guess, I've been reflecting a little bit on, the question of who I am right now. And I was thinking about what brought forth for me, because it brought forth so many connections. Who am I right now? And it reminded me that I bring many people with me, and so many people have formed who I am, including the clients that I've been working with. And I was at a recent Association of Family Therapy conference last week, in fact, and I met Professor Divine Charura, who was talking about Ubuntu, and he was talking about that as the belief. That's a belief in a universal bond uh, of sharing that connects all humanity. And he was explaining in his culture that there's an assumption that when you meet someone again, that they need to introduce themselves as the new you. Who are you bringing now? And I guess I was thinking, wow, who was I at the start of the Fellows Project, and who am I now? And it made me realize that I'm bringing a whole lot more people with me than I did even back then. And that made me think about, another person that's influenced me is another therapist, Glenda Fredman. And she was also talking about Ubuntu, and she was saying, who do you bring? So I was thinking, who do I bring with me today? Well, I have my ancestors because they make up who I am, particularly my mom and my gran. And I'm bringing Peter, my colleagues. I'm bringing Kim, of course, Kim Pierce, and obviously Marit, she's always with me, and my clients, and lots of writers, lots of people who've influenced me in my work. And yeah, who do you bring, Abby?
I thank you for posing that question back to me. I was just going to say that's such a beautiful way to frame it. A connection I've noticed across doing so many podcasts now is that a lot of times when I say, who are you, or ask people to introduce themselves, they go to talking about their relationships, which I think makes a lot of sense, especially for our kind of communication lens that we're using. So thinking about who I'm bringing, specifically in the context of this podcast, I feel very lucky to feel like I am bringing, or maybe another way I'd say it is kind of standing on the shoulders of so many people that have come before me or are working right now, people that I get to collaborate with that have been working with CMM for decades. And have known about CMM for maybe 3 years at this point. And so it's very exciting to me. And I can already tell that it's something that is going to stay with me for the rest of my life. But it's really special to have, in a lot of ways, friendships, but also mentorships. I definitely consider a lot of the people I work with mentors. And so Kim Pierce is a huge mentor to me. And then I get to interact very closely with a lot of people at the CMM Institute. And even, I've never got to meet Barnett, who is one of the creators of the theory. For people listening, I know that you know that, but I'll just say that to clarify. But he's one of the people that, I'm standing on the shoulders of because they have laid this foundation. And you, even though I've not gotten to meet you until today, in a way, like your work has contributed to my work because I'm so interested in making CMM accessible to people. And so when I make my little infographics about the loop model, that's informed by you and your work. And so specifically in the context of CMM and communication and this kind of world of this podcast that I've gotten to create, those are kind of the people that I'm bringing with me. And I learned so much on this podcast. As we're recording right now, I'm also this week editing my podcast that'll come out this next week. And it's one, you might actually know this person, but John Burnham, another systemic therapist. And he and I recorded a conversation together back in 2022, but I'm re-releasing it because that's something I'm doing this year to try to kind of recontextualize and go back to some of this wisdom. And listening back, I'm learning so much again, even though, I already had that conversation and published it. Listening back, it's reminding me of things. And so I'm even being reminded of some of the language I use now that I couldn't quite remember who said it to me first. Listening to this conversation, I'm going, oh, John was the one to say this. This is where I heard it. So he's someone too that I would definitely point out. So I really appreciate that question.
Isn't that so interesting? You're bringing your new you to something that you've already recorded.
Yes.
it
Yes.
adds something else, doesn't it? That's wonderful.
Yeah, that additional going back 2 years later layer of reflection has been, yeah, I've definitely learned new things or things that I, have already heard are speaking to me differently at this point. So that especially, I think this is interesting for this conversation for us to talk about Undigested Stories, this project that kind of emerged for you as a fellow back in 2017. I'm curious how it's evolved for you too in this time period. So unless there's anything else you want to say to introduce yourself, I'd love to just jump into Undigested Stories, what it means for you, how this developed for you.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Beautiful.
I guess I need to go probably all the way back to when I was a student, a systemic psychotherapist student, trying to put together a dissertation. I decided that I wanted to do my dissertation around systemic interventions with the dying and the bereaved, partly because I was working in a GP practice at the time, and a lot of the work that I was doing was bereavement work. So it felt like a really close subject for me. And I think at that time, I was just very aware of some of the professional things that had been written around grief, and also some of the personal experiences I'd had of grief didn't quite match for me. And
Interesting.
I suppose previously I'd learned about staged models of grief, phased models, and this idea that that you're healthy once you've that there's an end point of grief, and once you've got to the end of that, then that would involve finally letting go your loved one and so on. And a lot that I'd read previously about grief didn't fit with my personal experience. So I was really interested in what the systemic world had to say about grief. And so that was my project. And I came across the work of Nancy Knowles in Canada, and also Carol Lorraine Hedke had written a lot about remembering conversations, and the work of Michael White about remembering your loved one back in. So my project was around that, and I took that into my work as a therapist after I graduated. And what I noticed, the more I worked, the more I realized that a lot of my reactions and clients' reactions were embodied reactions when, words weren't necessarily available. And I guess I continued to train in trauma therapies, and I was more interested in some body-based approaches, and read, the work of Bessel van der Kolk and Damasio and Peter Levine, and I was influenced by, I guess, what the world was learning about. I wasn't the only one, right? I was probably late to the party, but I was learning. And so that began to really emerge in my work a lot more. Then there's always a personal story along with a professional story, right? They coexist.
Yes.
And what was happening in my life personally was that my mum became actually ill during the time that I was in my final year of study, and then she progressively got worse. And so there was that story for me of this embodied sense of grief. And then my mum died in March 2016, and in May 2016, I went to a workshop that Kim Pierce took in London at the Institute of Family Therapy, and it was on spirituality and well-being, and it just connected so much. Kim brought so much of her own story of grief and her own journey of spirituality. And I can remember sitting with this tension in my body between professional knowledges, personal knowledges, and my body was talking and professional knowledges were talking and personal stories were all talking at the same time. And as part of the group process, we were journeying through the loop model, and Kim said to the group, I'm always interested in extending models, and if anyone has a new idea, please share and extend the model. And just something sat with me about this grief for me right now feels undigested, and it just floated out of my mouth. And Kim went, "Oh yeah, this is." Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you should go with that. Well, life moved on, and I took, I guess, that idea into my work a bit more. But it was actually really the fellows program and the project that we did for that really cemented it for me. And we ended up learning so much from the process and from our clients. And Peter's journey through the loop model and my journey through the loop model with the others in the group. And I do want to sort of move on and tell you a bit more about that group experience and how that really cemented the undigested as I knew you in the loop model. This might be a good time to, before I delve into that, would it be okay if I shared the definition that we've come up with?
Please, yes.
And I'm asking already that you hear it within the sort of context that is probably not fully formed and will probably change. And will at some point, no doubt, I will have a different relationship with it and think, oh, why did we say that? And I'm sort of struck by something that Barnett Pierce said. He said, we should treat all stories, our own and others, as incomplete, unfinished, biased, and inconsistent. And so partly I need you to show up and hear it like that.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. That's great context to give.
So the definition of undigested stories is the process of being with a story experience that remains unprocessed and unresolved. It's sometimes unvoiced and sometimes invisible. The experience is embodied and often felt rather than expressed. This felt sense can be often experienced as a continuous fluctuation between awareness and unawareness. And I guess the main point there is it's a process and it's embodied. I would love to say that we led with that when we went into the first group, but we didn't. It was almost like I needed the group process to cement the idea of undigested. And so the Fellows project was actually about Mind the Gap. And I wanted to sort of highlight the gap in a gap in the social world of what's written in terms of Western approaches to grief processes that show up in, well, it shows up everywhere. It shows up in condolence cards, and it shows up in the way that people talk, and it shows up in the expectations, and it invites grief to be measured as something that's time phased or restricted. And the gap between that and the research that was around, and the research that's been around really for the last 30 to 40 years, which was actually more about continuing bonds being a more helpful approach to people who were bereaved. And the concept that of, remembering them back in to your community and keeping them with you, in other words. And And so that I felt that was a big gap in the social world. And so we wanted to do a project that was going to pay attention to that. Um, and a lot of the work that I was doing with individuals and the work that Peter was doing with individuals and families was based around postmodern ideas of grief approaches that were based on continuing bonds. And so we wanted a project that reflected that. And the more I'd worked with remembering conversations, the more I realized that for me, there was another added aspect. I naturally started to move into the loop model, and I started to fold that into the conversations. And as I was inviting people to tell me about their loved one, I was inviting stories, and I couldn't help but travel through the loop model.
Yeah.
It just emerged out of me, and it feels a natural place for me to live. And so we wanted to fold that in as a practice, but within a group context. And so Peter and I had a group of first time round, I think we had nine in the first group. And we decided that we would go with a kind of closed group approach where it was, people that we already knew as clients that we felt were ready to take on a group experience and ready to take on, I guess, a reflective process of being in the loop model rather than open it up to the general public where we weren't quite sure what stage people were at and so on. And so the first group took place before the Fellows Learning Exchange in October 2017. So I guess maybe I should tell you a little bit about the first group first, and then
Great.
be on with the second. And so probably one of the untold stories at the time was that I was personally sitting with quite a lot of uncertainty because my health wasn't good at the time, and I suppose that part of me was a bit afraid. I didn't know what was going to happen next, and the context of being in that group experience when I was also going through this personal process that somehow led me to really listen closely. It made me in some ways more present. I felt very present with my own body. Perhaps I should say just a little bit about what we did in the group before I explain this one particular evening. We invited people to introduce their loved ones, say who they were in life, and we did a little bit of education around, how dominant ideas around grief invited their ways of how they felt constrained in grief, what other people had said to them, and also did quite a lot of work around making sure that they understood a little bit more about the research around grief and continuing bonds. We explained a little bit about the loop model as well, and we invited people to come with different stories, and some of that work was done personally in homework exercises, particularly around the loop model, and some of that work was shared within the group when people wanted to share it. The opening evening, Peter and I arranged the chairs, and we arranged it workshop style. 2 presenters at the front, and then the other 9 people in the group. And I look back at that and I can't believe I was stupid as that or crazy to do that. And it didn't take us very long. There's this, we had a break for coffee, and Peter and I looked at each other and we both knew. And we both went, "Got to move the chairs." Like, what were we thinking? That was so, oh my gosh, that was just crazy. And so there was something about moving these chairs and something about making it a circle that felt ancestral.
Mm.
It felt like it was moving into an old way that felt very natural and very comfortable. And by the end of the evening, I was definitely sitting with, gosh, how many people are in this room? Because it felt like there were more
Yeah.
than just us. And other people in the group started to say that, and Peter was sitting with that too. And our clients were naming it. Wow, once they'd introduced their loved one and said who they were in life, it just filled the room. And
Yeah.
I think it was really important to create that context where we were honoring who else was there.
Mhm.
And so we always started with that as as an introduction each evening, acknowledging who was there. And sometimes we would do that by placing objects on the table, an object that was important to the loved one or something that had been passed down. Or sometimes it was a photograph or a piece of prose or poem or something that reflected the life of the person. And actually the loved one, the deceased person's influences in their lives too, they were brought into
Mm.
that process too. So there was honoring of many aspects of self, both the client that was in the room and then their loved ones too, and Peter's relationships, with his loved ones that had passed, and mine too, and that sharing and that honoring really set a context for learning from one another and laughing with one another and holding pain in a really important way. So I guess I'll pick back to what I was beginning. I was jumping ahead earlier, but I was thinking of one particular evening when I'd had some bad news that day, and Peter was saying, I think maybe we should cancel tonight's group. And, perhaps in hindsight, I can see where he's coming from.
Mhm.
And I probably should have taken more time for self-care. But the truth is I didn't, and I wanted to go ahead and probably preoccupied with, I don't want to let people down and all of these stories.
Yeah.
Um, and But it struck me that it was that night that something really important happened in the group. And by this point, we were really focusing in on the unheard and the untellable. And these were difficult stories to digest. These were the undigested stories that were really coming up. And one person shared something that he'd written in his diary and his homework that he'd done in between the sessions. And I should say that if I refer to any client, they are completely de-identified and
Yes.
have given full permission to share. In fact, have greatly encouraged the sharing. And so there's this piece of prose and story that was shared was entitled Unheard and Untellable by this young man. Before I read out what he'd written, I want to sort of explain a little bit about who he is and what he'd gone through and also what he'd been influenced and who he'd been influenced by in the group. By this point, he'd lost his father at a very young age,
Mm.
and then lost his mother when he was about I think 17 or 18. And he really struggled after that to find his way in the world. And he was a bit older by then and was successful in life in many ways, but had still really struggled to digest some of the memories that were around for him. And he was very influenced by a young woman in the group who was around the age, a couple of years older than he was when he lost his mother. She was very open and honest about her experience of losing her papa, her grandfather. And I think the way and what she brought and the way she was thinking, what she was describing really touched something in him, and had really taken him back to the time of, I guess, the difficult stage of seeing his mother very, very ill. And so this is what he wrote. That the idea of fear, how afraid she was, and how she could not tell me. How she wanted to spend more time, but I chose to be separate and alone. I did not want to speak of her fear and death. Maybe because I was so jaded, it became monstrous, even boring. I was too young and too protected to realise what I was losing. Not only a person, but untold memories, emotions and wishes. In her last, I played a blind man, out of choices. Someone who knew there was pain, but only wanted it to not exist rather than see it. I wanted to leave, but in my heart, I had nowhere to go. My life was limbo, and I treated my own mother like a patient, not the friend she needed. Only with her death and my freedom can I see what I'd lost. The irony is that by not being hindered day by day, only now do I know what I want. A catch-22 as morbid as it is hilarious. I miss her so much, but only because she's gone. And I think every time I hear that or read that out loud, I'm taken back to that moment in the group and the effect that it had. And somehow, I'm not sure how, other than probably my body told me, Peter and I held the silence, and everyone sat with silence. You could have heard a pin drop. There was just a warmth to the silence. There was a beingness. There was a relationally embodied connection that was happening in the room that you could feel together. And I can see you nod. I'm so aware that you're silent, Abby, right now.
That definitely made me tear up just having you read that. And so I can imagine the power of that in a space. I'm so excited to get to talk to you about this language, because I think that language is so powerful when we can name things. And so that, I think, is a really beautiful example of your experience, what you got to see firsthand of what it can mean to people to have this language around stories and grief, and what it can open up for people when they didn't have language like that before. That's really beautiful, and really beautiful, the space that it seems like you were able to create.
Yeah, it was definitely an embodied story, and it felt undigested.
Yes.
Like it wasn't
Raw.
it was very raw. And I think up until that point, people hadn't risked as much as this young man. And we concluded that night and thought, wow, that was really powerful. But people were left in a very sort of respectful, warm way with one another. You could tell it touched people. And then the week after, it was transformative in the group, and I hadn't named anything as undigested at that point.
Yes.
People were coming back with those words, and I thought, wow, this is exactly how it felt for me, and that there were still undigested parts for me in relation to my own mother. And many people began to open and talk about their experiences. And Um, and it gave way to other stories that hadn't been able to be digested. And some of them were untold. They were just named as it helped me process something.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were shared more openly. But it changed the direction of the group. And it felt like a really important time and a really important word that had been named again. I thought, wow, here this comes up again.
It's striking me again, just the importance of the addition of undigested stories to the loop model and making that distinction because, like you said, this young man had this beautiful language to be able to name some of the untold stories, but that does not make them digested. And so this interesting kind of in between that hadn't been named up to that point of, okay, well, a story might go from untold to told to an extent, but not necessarily be digested. And so that's maybe that. I would imagine that that's maybe that kind of in between space mirrors
that liminal space.
Yeah, that space maybe mirrors your experience of the distance between what was being written about grief, about the stages of grief and the, kind of timeliness of grief and whatever, and your real experience. Maybe it's like that distance is that space and that lack of language to speak into that space.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad that the people you've worked with encouraged you to share. And it kind of doesn't surprise me though, that like that is a very generative thing that when you then, in the group, you could see week to week how it transformed. And so I can imagine those people wanting to pass that along.
Oh, very
and
much.
Saying, please share our stuff so more people can be transformed.
Absolutely. That's exactly what happened. And, we almost couldn't stop them from sharing. It was
too much.
Really, we'd opened a box and then that was it. It was just, okay, I've got to say this. And it just kept going and going and going. I mean, I can tell you, I know roughly what the quote said, and then I'll tell you this other one, but I guess it comes back to how on the back of hearing that unheard and untellable, something shifted in this client's body. And she talked about how at first, when she heard the story, she could finally begin to name for herself where she felt things in her body.
Wow.
I guess it was based around, I was thinking about Damasio's work and how he firstly talks about, you first of all feel it in, all these different places in your body, and then it shifts into a felt sense, and then there's a meaning that's made around it. And that's essentially what she was saying.
Yeah.
And now that I've been able to be with it and name it, somehow it's shifted and it's not feeling as intense. And that's the basis of what she was saying. And then another group member said, it's funny, this is a quote, it's funny, I tell you a distressing story and you calm me down, and then I don't feel as distressed anymore. It's almost like your emotions are calming mine. And I thought, wow, isn't it lovely when these bodies join together and they do the work for us?
Yes. Wow.
I guess when that happened, when that was named in the group, Peter and I became much more aware of this process of undigested. And so when we ran the next bereavement group, we very definitely included the undigested in the loop model. And that actually brought forth a lot in the second group as well. And I was thinking about one person in particular in the group, the second group, who had not been able to name much about his process of grief with his father, partly because of a cultural story that was around for him. don't speak ill of the dead. And anytime, in my individual work with them, anytime his father was mentioned as part of a story, he would literally put his hand over his mouth like this, and he would get up and he would pace up and down, and he would say, my body can't contain it. My body can't contain it.
Wow.
Um, and um, yeah, obviously I had to do quite a lot of work with him before he came
Yeah.
into the group. But again, being able to move through the loop model and move through these different stories, he was able to work through the unheard and the untellable and
Mm,
move into reconnections of being able to see his father in a fuller way.
mm,
Not just this person that he disconnected with because some difficult things had happened in the relationship, but he was able to access stories once the undigested had
mm.
um, managed to be passed through in some way, so to speak. He was
Right.
able to reconnect with what his father had given him, and so a lot of what he shared post group in the feedback was very much about I can play the guitar again. I can teach my son the guitar.
Oh.
That's his father's legacy and his grandfather's legacy.
Mm,
And it was very performative. He was performing the legacy and sharing.
mm,
And so it made me think about how there's so many ripples on the pond. You don't know
mm.
where the loop model is going to take you,
Yes.
because the loop model continues in this internalized experience that then gets passed on to others. Um, there was one lady in the second group who said she was very supportive in the group. She would be very supportive of others, but she really struggled to share much of her own grief.
Hmm.
She'd lost her mother, she'd lost her father, and she was taking care of a young man who had lost his mother and his brother. And then her husband lost his father, and she just felt like she was in the sea of
Yeah.
loss. Um, and so I think that she was very present in the group, but couldn't tell many stories.
Mm,
But she was working through the loop model, and other people's shared stories.
mm,
She held them, and
mm.
she was desperate to come back to give feedback. It was 18 months later. She's like, I have to come and talk to you. I have to tell you this. And I have permission to share this, but she was telling me that since the group, her stepfather, who she was very close to, had passed. And she said, I held the group. I realized I held the group inside. It stayed with me. The loop model stayed with me. And
Oh,
I was able to hold the stories and what I'd worked through. It just took me longer. I couldn't say it at the time, but it stayed in me. And it helped me when I lost him. I was able to, find ways of managing differently. So there was this lovely ripple effect into
yeah.
um her own life.
Mm,
And then again, there's someone else I'm thinking of that she had lost her mother as a teenager, and then she lost her aunt, and um, she's still someone that I see from time to time, and she works in a job where she has her own clients, and not in a therapy context, but in a different context, and uh, there there are some people that she has shared with about the group,
mm.
and talked to them about the loop model and invited stories, and said, oh, you need to go and be part of this, and the ripple effect. And they've come along. I've
Wow.
had two ladies that have referred themselves. So it's lovely to see the ripples on the pond in that respect.
Mm. Yeah, I think you and I both know how powerful stories are. And so it's cool to see that on a couple levels right now in your telling of this, because you are explaining how the stories that were told in that moment created new stories and helped the other individuals in that group share their story. And then also I'm feeling that your sharing of this story in this moment is also powerful. It's making me feel and think a lot of things. And I think that I'm experiencing maybe part of that embodiment that you're talking about that is maybe unique to conversations around grief and loss, is that that's something that everybody has experienced or will
Sure.
experience, to some extent in their own way in their life. So maybe there's like a little bit of that recognition. And again, it's almost like a permission in the sharing of our stories, giving each other permission to share stories and just take a weight off of ourselves by, I think there's kind of a tension that comes with holding in these untold stories or when stories are left undigested. And that's what your whole work is about.
Yeah. 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 Thank you for noticing that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. As we start to wrap up, what else would you like to say about undigested stories and maybe specifically from the time of this initial project with the groups? How has it evolved or how has it continued to show up in your work in your life since then?
I think that I still continue to work in this way. I still feel very connected to the idea that grief is a relational process.
Mm.
And I I learn a lot from my clients when I can just be with them and be with them in the life of their loved ones, helping them reclaim who they are to them. Um, I think that I don't think I could ever be disembodied in my approach now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just as you were saying earlier, that the loop model will always be with you. You
Yes.
can't unlearn
Yes.
CMM, can you? You can't
No.
unlearn the loop model. And I think because of that, I think that I can't unlearn seeing grief as a relational process. And yeah, just the I think there was a more of a relational embodiment. I think I'm much more sort of struck by that there's a process that happens when you bring people together, and there's can be this relationally held embodiment that can be healing and felt collectively. That just really makes me very happy. If we can join together like that, we can have a better social world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One question I'm curious about is the naming of the undigested stories. I think on its own is so powerful, but in your work and in your practice, I'm curious, do you find that that's kind of where it stops for people? Or is there any kind of process that you intentionally go through with people about digesting those undigested stories?
Um, I think in the last number of years, I've done a lot more somatic-based training, mainly with Ariel Schwartz. She's a somatic psychologist, and um, learning ways to be with the body and honor what the body is saying. I think that is always part of my process now, and folding in remembering conversations, folding in more embodied questions, and yeah, just felt sense. As you describe that, what are you experiencing in your body? So what is that felt sense telling you? So I think that's just a part of every part of what I do now. I don't always name it as undigested. Sometimes I do. Sometimes that fits really well. Sometimes a client will name it before I ever name it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't have to. And actually, even today, I was yeah, I was quite excited actually because I saw someone not long before we started our conversation, and it's a new client, and it I didn't use the word, but you just came into the conversation and she used the word. It just feels like it's sitting in me. It's just undigested.
Ah,
I don't know what to do. And I thought, okay, here we are again.
here we are. Yeah.
Felt like a nice sort of synchronous moment.
Hmm.
I have also done some EMDR training, and a
Yeah.
lot of it's body based, and yeah, sometimes I'll use that as a process to
Hmm.
be with the body.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think probably one of the things I'm most grateful for in this conversation is the context you've added about this embodiment piece of it. And I think it just adds a layer of meaning to undigested stories, which is obviously a reference to a physical process that happens in the body. And it's making me think of, in my own experience, my own therapy experience too. I know there is a very real difference between kind of knowing things up here in my
Mm,
brain and knowing them in my body. Maybe especially when it comes to like feelings of anxiety or fear in situations. I can tell myself, you don't need to be anxious or afraid in this situation, but my body doesn't know it yet because it's something that's deeply in there. And so it makes sense that the uh, kind of response to being able to name an undigested story in order to be able to try to digest that story would be tending to the physical body. And that still makes sense to me, and it's still in my mind under this umbrella of communication, because I think communication is just so expansive, and we really limit ourselves when we just think of communication as the words we say, because we
yeah,
communicate through so many other means and through the kind of spaces we create for each other in which to tell our stories.
yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what? I think that it was always there in CMM. I can't remember whether it was Barnett or whether it was Kim, that said the life of dialogue is also in relationship with one's own body.
Mhm.
So it was there in CMM. It's just been named in, this process. Although I probably would add to the life of dialogue is also in relationship with one's own body and with another's.
Yes.
A lovely aspect to bring into
Mhm.
our work.
Yeah. Well, Tracey, one of the questions that I like to end with is using the CMM language that you'll be familiar with. And I kind of see this as a chance to maybe recap some of what we've already talked about today, and then also kind of send us on our way thinking about the future and imagining what could be. And so I want to ask you, what's your vision for a better social world, specifically as it relates to grief, the way we experience it and the way we show up to others?
Mm. I think the first thing that comes to mind there is honoring. And I've been involved recently in a project. I won't say too much about it, but that's taking us back to our own Indigenous wisdoms. And one of the things I love about Indigenous practices is the honouring of who's gone before. And I think we started this conversation like that today.
Yes, we're coming
And you
full
were talking
circle.
on, yeah, you were, talking about standing on the shoulders of. I think honouring what's gone before is a big part of what we need to do. And I include all living things there,
Yes.
honouring the earth, all living things. That is that needs to be a big part of our social world going forward. Um, I I have a struggle with things being complete. So I think I'm quite connected to the idea of I'm yeah, don't judge me, I'm not finished yet.
Yes. Yes.
And in the words of Coldplay, because I've got to get them in there, I'm really attached to the idea of I'd rather be a comma than a full stop is a lyric in one of their songs.
Yes.
And it's just that's always really stuck with me. I think that if we could take that approach with people, that we're all commas, we're not full stops, there's room for growth,
Yes.
more opportunity to get things wrong and learn and be met with compassion as we learn. And I think some of the best teachers that I've had, teachers in life, have been people who have wholly accepted me. And I think I then go back to thinking about my grandmother and how she taught me to be. And she would tell me that difference is good. Difference is good. And there was a story in our family, just to finish with a story.
Yeah.
I never knew my papa, but his words lingered in our family, and his words were, just remember, not everyone is like yourself. And half of my family seemed to take this to mean be suspicious, because not everyone's like you.
Oh, uh-huh.
And my grandmother very much taught me the opposite. Hers very much was about you know, difference is good. It wouldn't be a good world if we were all the same. So I
Yes.
guess a better social world would be this diversity and this love of difference. And I was talking to someone at the conference last week. In fact, I wrote down in my notebook. I used to think that it would be a better world if we all thought the same. But I've grown up and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
realized my grandmother was right. Difference is good.
Yes.
So that, I think, would create a better social world.
Yes, that's beautiful. That's a great note to end on. Tracey, did you feel like you got to say everything you wanted to say? I just want to check in one more time. I know we can't make it complete. There's only so much we can do in an hour. It's always a struggle. I always
Absolutely.
feel like I could talk on and on.
I'm very happy to be a comma here and not a full stop. There's
Beautiful.
always
Yes.
to say. Thank
Beautiful.
you.
This is a
Thank you so
comment.
much,
Yes.
Abby.
Thank you so much, Tracey. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Tracey. At the end of each episode, I like to offer questions to reflect on, which act as a next turn. So the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, just one question I would have you think about, very simple sounding at least. It is, what are your undigested stories? I think this is a new language, a new concept for many of us. So not going to try to get ahead of ourselves. Let's just start by doing that identifying and naming piece that, as we heard Tracey share today, can be really powerful on its own. So what are your undigested stories? If you'd like, you are always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections to our question, our next turn question. I'm also always happy to hear any of your own questions or ideas. You can connect with me through email, the website, by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, as well as our CMM Institute Substack. Links to all of those places are in the show notes to make it easy for you. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue, such an important value of CMM. And other great ways to stay in dialogue is to follow the show wherever you've listened, leave a rating and review, share this episode, and like I mentioned at the top of the episode, take that survey and help me to have a better idea of what we want this podcast to be going forward. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to equip us to create better social worlds through better communication. Another initiative that I've been heavily involved in is our upcoming Cosmo Parenting podcast that'll begin airing in January of 2025. But you can go ahead and subscribe to the Cosmo Parenting Substack now so you never miss an episode, and those can appear right in your inbox. This is a continuation of our existing Cosmo activities line of social emotional resources. Again, all with the goal of helping empower us to create better social worlds. So we're really excited for those resources. That's something I am helping to facilitate. And like I get to do on this podcast, I've been able to be in lots of really meaningful conversation And I'll be excited for you to hear that. So if you are parenting, if you know someone parenting, check out the link in the show notes and subscribe to the Cosmo Parenting Substack. You can learn more about the CMM Institute's other initiatives as well in the other show notes, in the other links you'll see in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.